Earlier in the show, we discussed the probe into the Capitol riot. Now, it's rightfully getting a lot of attention. That is, new details and new questions come to light. But there is a lot more happening on Capitol Hill, debates that will have huge impacts on you and your family. And for that, let's bring back Andrew Whitman.
And Rich, after a lengthy delay, the Senate is now getting into the nitty-gritty of the stimulus bill. The delay of 10 hours and 43 minutes last night in the middle of a national emergency came thanks to Wisconsin Republican Ron Johnson, who had to sit in the chamber the entire time because nobody else wanted to help him delay the debate. A slew of votes and amendments expected today as we speak, including a tweak to unemployment benefits. An effort from Bernie Sanders to put the $15 minimum wage back in the stimulus bill failed in an early vote this afternoon. This after the House passed a sweeping election reform bill earlier in the week, and it reads like a Democratic fantasy for voting causes. It would guarantee mail-in voting, no reason needed, guarantee 15 days of early voting, make states automatically register every American adult to vote, give voting rights to all felons, require paper ballots, force the disclosure of dark hidden political donations. It would also require states to use independent redistricting commissions, set standards for election equipment like vote reading machines, require disclosures for all online political ads. It would set an ethics code for Supreme Court justices, restructure the FEC so it can no longer get stuck with tie votes, and require presidential candidates to release their tax returns. No wonder Republicans hate this bill. But as that's happening, 106 bills in 26 states have been advanced to restrict voting access. And the Supreme Court this week heard a voting case and seems primed to allow even more voter restrictions. All that requires some analysis, which leads us to Dahlia Lithwick. Dahlia is the senior legal correspondent at Slate Magazine. Dahlia, I actually want to begin with the state legislatures, those 106 bills in 26 states to restrict voting access, because I don't think this point has been made clearly enough. Republicans are using Donald Trump's lies about election fraud as the basis for these restrictions. The big lie didn't work in 2020, so they're trying to use the big lie to change the rules and game the next election. Fair read?
A fair read, and I might even go so far as say that number has been updated. The Brennan Center has amped up the number 253 bills with restrictive voting access provisions in 43 states. The Brennan Center is calling this the most significant wave of restrictions since the Jim Crow era. So this is off any chart we've ever seen. And you're completely right. The rhetoric is all rooted in this idea that the last election was stolen, so we're going to prevent future vote fraud by making it almost impossible to vote.
Now, in a rational America, Democrats could take those changes to federal court, but the federal court is now littered with Trump and McConnell appointees. And speaking of which, the Supreme Court hearing this week. We saw the headline, "Court appears to favor upholding voting laws that lower court found unfair to minorities." Is that a fair reading of how the arguments went? And if they rule that way, how much more damage will legislators be able to do on voter access? Will it be a race to the bottom in these states?
It's interesting because I think going into this particular argument, which is called Brnovich versus the DNC, this is probably the signal voting rights case, probably the most important the court has heard since Shelby County in 2013 that gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. And going into this particular lawsuit, I think a lot of us felt like this is the end. This is the death knell for Section 2, which is the only section of the Voting Rights Act that still could be useful. It looked like an effort to kind of sideline that, in which case I think you're right. Then it's just fair game. It's just hunting season. There's no way for civil rights groups to protect themselves. It was a funny argument in some sense because the defenders of these two Arizona measures that were being challenged under Section 2 took such an extreme position that at one point Justice Elena Kagan was challenging one of the lawyers saying, so you're saying even if you forced all voters to go vote at a country club that had a history of restricting its membership to whites, that could be okay? And even conceding that was problematic. So in some sense, the argument didn't go as badly for voting rights advocates as some of us feared because the position that was staked out by Arizona and the Republican Party defending the law, defending doing away with Section 2 was so extreme that even the conservatives were like, oh, I don't think we want to use that test. So in some sense, this case may not be the death knell for Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, but it's clear, I think, that there are 6 members of the court that are looking for some vehicle, if not this one, to end Section 2 as well.
I'll come back to the court hearing in just a moment, Dahlia, but we also went through that list of election reforms that the House passed this week. It was like an oasis in the middle of a voting desert. And I'm sure those reforms would be fantastic if passed. But if the Supreme Court sides with the restrictions in the case they heard this week, wouldn't the court be primed to overturn that House bill even if it passes, especially because the bill also sticks ethics rules on the justices themselves?
I think the fact that there's tons of stuff in there that's going to be challenged shouldn't distract from the fact that this is the single most, I would say, existential moment in democracy reform that we're seeing in this country. Whether every single page of this 800-page bill survives, whether it even survives Senate, the attempt to pass it in the Senate, isn't the question. I think the question loops back to where we started, which is if we don't construct a world in which the right to vote is protected, the principle of one person, one vote is absolutely secure, then you are going to see more and more and more state efforts, red state efforts, to circumscribe the right to vote. So my sense of it is, we'll talk about what parts of it are going to be struck down by the courts. There's already a huge effort, dark money effort, to say the whole bill is unconstitutional. So you're right, that's coming. But I think the larger issue is whether or not it's going to be struck down by the courts. This laser focus on how we restore the integrity of elections has to be issue number one, even in COVID times, issue number one if we want to have a fair election system.
And Democrats are saying the bill's all about fairness. Republicans are almost unanimously saying it'll hurt their electoral chances. Sounds like they're both right.
I think they're both right. And just to go back for a second to that Supreme Court argument on Tuesday in that big voting rights case, there was an amazing moment when one of the lawyers who was trying to say, oh, Section 2 doesn't apply, it's never going to apply, Amy Coney Barrett was challenging him on, why are you even in this case? Why is the Republican Party in this case on behalf of upholding these Arizona voting restrictions? And his answer was this completely amazing confession that we're in this case because, as he said, the Republican Party interest is to remain at a competitive advantage relative to Democrats. He said voting is a zero-sum game. And it was kind of saying the quiet part out loud. Everybody in the courtroom was like, did he just say that they're in the game to suppress the vote? But I think that goes to your question in some sense. Both sides agree that if this effort to make it harder and harder and harder, particularly for minorities, particularly for the poor, particularly as long as pandemic continues for the ill, to get to their polling places, if this really persists, it will be because I think red states realize that the landmark turnout in the 2020 election, the amazing desire of the American people to vote despite all these restraints, that's the thing they're trying to choke now.
Finally, Dahlia, we've had updates from state legislatures, from Congress, and from the Supreme Court. What about the Biden administration and especially the Biden Justice Department? Quickly, is there anything they can do to either reverse these restrictions or at least try and slow them down?
The Biden Justice Department is still not staffed up. In some sense, the civil rights folks are still facing real headwinds in terms of even getting confirmed. So it's going to take a minute for them to get in the game here. But I think it's absolutely clear that Biden has appointed people to his Justice Department like Vanita Gupta, like Kristen Clark, even Merrick Garland, who take the right to vote very, very seriously. My sense is he could have picked other people if this wasn't a priority. So I believe that he is signaling with these appointees, if they get confirmed, that, again, issue one, top of the charts for this voting rights issue at the Justice Department will be making sure that we go back to an era of serious one person, one vote democracy reform.
Dahlia Lithwick is the senior legal correspondent with Slate. Dahlia, it's always an education. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me.
Rich?
Andrew, thank you. When we come back, believe it or not, I got some good news for you. We're going to show you a few inspirational stories of people helping other people. We all need a shot in the arm right now.